Hi. We dis sorry. We discussed a paper about the research consciousness after reading 2 hours, and now we are discussing casually. So, and now let me introduce us. And Aniko, please.
Hi, I'm Aniko Kustor. I'm a PhD student at Monash University.
And Yota.
My name is Yota Kawashima. I'm a research assistant at ATR Japan and Monash University.
Thank you. And me, I'm Ryoichi Watanabe at Kyoto University and a PhD student. So next, we introduce today's paper. Today's paper we read is expanding the discussion, revision of the fundamental assumptions framing the study of the neural correlates of consciousness, written by Daniel Revach and Salti, and Conscious and Cognition. Okay, so I will summarize this briefly. And first of all, in context of the conscious research, the Crick and cohort introduced the NCC, neural correlate of consciousness, and the consciousness study was advanced. And the NCC have 9 concepts and 3 explicit concepts, like the neurobiological approach and the conscious unconscious contrast, and finally reflective approach. And implicit assumption, the first one, the conscious resolution, the temporal modality, the spatial modality, and the conscious retention. And 5 is a post-conscious mechanism, and finally passive observer. And in these 9 assumptions was considered the NCC concept, but in this paper, the authors criticize these idea of NCC and the idea of assumption. And in fact, there are the other problem of consciousness, like the timing of occurrence consciousness, and the conscious occurrence is all or nothing or gradual, and the NCC of report paradigm and non-report paradigm was different. So these problems were not answered, these assumptions. So in this paper, the authors tell their ideas of and rethink the assumptions. And the author's idea is following, that for the problem of the non-conscious and the reportability, we can examine the back propagation of visual cortex V1 and the no-report paradigm are combined, which shows the dynamics of consciousness in new knowledge. And secondly, the measure of the global information transformation of IIT, and which showed the complex spatial and temporal changes in the brain. We can examine these and understand the problems. And also the authors claim and rethink these assumptions for the implicit assumption 1, which means the neurobiological approach, and the approach conscious and non-conscious contrast. Because in fact, and according to previous empirical research shows that consciousness is not the birth and the end of the process of non-consciousness processing, but also the information processing shows and the information processing themselves show their consciousness. And also, in implicit assumption 5, post-conscious mechanisms. The authors rethink that normally the after of conscious processing is included in conscious perception. Maybe so. We cannot separate the conscious corresponding on the real NCC and after of consciousness NCC. And also the implicit assumption 2 and 3, temporal and spatial modularity also need to rethink, because yes, a lot of studies shows that the brain processes of information are described not the one place, but also the other place parallelly. So deprivated information process. So the time and space is not one for the consciousness or NCC. And also finally, the authors are introduced that the phenomenal point is important to the next study, right? And the author this idea explained as the Northrop temporal spatial theory of consciousness, TTC, is as the example. And according to this study, the authors concludes that yes, the NCC approach of Crick and Coho is more important, but we need to improve this approach to the new idea and the new knowledge of consciousness. Yes, my summary is done, and please add any question.
So I think first we need to say that you mentioned that the NCC approach by Crick and Koch assumed 8 things, but the 3 assumptions were explicitly stated in the NCC approach or paper by the Crick and Koch, but the other 5 assumptions were implicit. So they were not stated in any paper, I think.
It was actually, it's 6 implicit assumptions.
Yeah, 6. Yeah, sorry. But yeah, anyway. So I think these assumptions were considered based on other neuroscientific findings and somehow form variation of NCC approaches. So it's not the intention by the Crick and Koch, probably. But I agree with the author's idea because, well, the benefit, or there are many findings from NCC approaches, and that's, you know, contributed consciousness research a lot. That's good things, but at the same time, the approach is not the perfect one, and it assumes a lot of things, which probably some of them have never been tested. So we are at the point to, you know, revisit these assumptions and check whether the NCC approaches are still the way we pursue, or we need to find another possibility to investigate the NCC, or not NCC, but some substrates related to consciousness. And I listed this paper based on the title because my current project is somehow related to this paper, I think. Aniko, you may know that, or you attended the last TLAB meeting, and where I not last, but 2 weeks ago, where I presented my work, and I also mentioned that the NCC approaches have some assumptions, but they are not tested yet. So in my project, I'm going to test one of the assumptions, which is, you know, the sequential concept of perception, in a sense. So yeah, I'm happy to, or I was really excited to read this paper, and I'm going to definitely cite this paper in my, you know, paper or in my projects. That's just a comment.
Oh yeah, just on this, I was wondering about this because, like, there are, I think, quite useful discussions and very good, like, well thought through arguments about, and especially with, like, in relation to ERP's event-related potential. So yeah, I was also thinking about, like, wow, now I actually thought that, like, you chose this, like, with that in mind, but anyhow, it's a lucky coincidence then. Something I wanted to add to the summary is, I think it's useful to, or at least for me, I am definitely a very, I'm very interested in philosophy of science, and that is why I was very happy to read that the authors kind of discuss, and I guess they kind of motivate their discussion by bringing up Thomas Kuhn's idea of the paradigm, and how kind of scientific thinking and scientific fields usually accept a common paradigm, but, you know, these kind of paradigms also limit the potential questions that we can ask, because they are inherently kind of so they always come with a set of assumptions. And I think this was one of the potential motivation of this paper, to discuss and really understand the assumptions behind the neural correlates of consciousness paradigm that has really influenced the last 30 years of consciousness research.
I see, and I also I'm interested in this paper because now my research question or my problem of consciousness study. I did now I want to examine the greatness of consciousness, right? Or nothing, or created, or when the consciousness happened, like in this paper or according to previous research, visual awareness negativity of 1 or negative 200 or right, and the other factor is the P3 or P300, and right positivity is also the conscious marker, but this is related to the after consciousness processing. Or yes, also this problem is more interested. And I'm a developmental, I study the developmental psychology, so no report paradigm and report paradigm is important for children or baby. Baby cannot report their experience. So I want to apply this method to infant study. So these problems are interested for me. So this paper also interested in reading.
Probably as an summary of this paper, we have to say that this is not research paper and not review. This is a suggestion paper, I think. So the point of this paper is just, we need to revisit the assumption of NCC approaches. And that's the main point of this paper. So there were no experiments, any like a plot, and just one figure and table to clarify their approach, their ideas. So I think that's something we need to mention as a summary. And I understand this paper's concept and why we need to, revisit the assumptions, NCC assumptions. But from here, what we need to think is that, okay, then what we can do as a next step, right? And in this paper, the authors suggested some possible research projects with recurrent processing ideas and also IIT's ideas, mentioned other possible like consciousness, theories of consciousness. But I want you to ask about, okay, then we understand this concept, but how we can, test some conscious related brain area without the assumption of the hierarchy or the sequential concept of consciousness or perception. Because last week I took a weekend online course which was about the behavioral method for neuroscience, where the lecturer emphasized the importance of decomposing one behavior into a set of processes. So, for example, if you want to understand some, perception, you need to do an experiment on perception. Let's say the color discrimination, and that will require the first input from the vision, and then after that the information will be used for the discrimination, and then after that you need to make a decision on it, and then that information will then be processed for motor response, And then finally, you move your fingers to make your response. And that kind of, sequential processes, it should be assumed to be, to test something. And then after that, you start to remove the confound. In this case, or we are interested in the discrimination of color. So first we need to remove the unconscious low-level visual processes, and also we need to remove the decision-making part and also motor response part, and then we can highlight the discrimination, color discrimination part. And that's is mentioned in this paper somehow, the kind of sequential assumption. And then based on that, we need to, compare or design some experience by comparing two experiments or the results from two experiments. And then by looking at the difference, you can see the one or the processes of your interest. But without these assumptions, let's say if you are interested in the color discrimination, how can we test? That's my question. Or it's very difficult, right? And I have no experiences in psychophysics. I've never designed any experiments, and also, just as a participant, I did some, but it does not, tell anything about the how or we can design one experiment, one psychophysics experiment. So I understand their claim, but it's not easy to, implement their ideas or just limited. I don't know.
But I think the point is it's not necessarily what they say, or the way how I understood their ideas is that first we need to think about whether this serial process assumption is right, and whether we can actually say that consciousness or the conscious experience does not involve the response, does not involve the decision making, it does not involve the first perceptual, I don't know, seconds or milliseconds of the experience. And this is, I think, a very powerful idea, and this is something very striking in a way, because I think at some point the authors described that, you can basically select out different sections of the process and then name them and then assign them different temporal and spatial kind of correlates and or characteristics, and kind of take them out of the kind of the sphere or out of the concept of consciousness. And then consciousness becomes this very weird or quick or kind of hard to describe and hard to actually pinpoint phenomena, because it's not processing, it's not perception, it's not decision making, it's not response, but then, okay, then what it is. And I think this is again, so just answering to your example, what is your question? What do you want to examine with color discrimination? Is it how people discriminate colors as a mechanism, or is it the conscious experience? And to answer the mechanism question, I think this serial approach is very fruitful. But I think the authors point out, and I think we also have been discussing a lot of similar papers and also in lab, and Nao's ideas about we should focus on the phenomenology. And if you want to talk about consciousness, you cannot just look at the mechanism and expect to understand everything without actually addressing phenomenology. Does that make sense, or does this kind of adds to this explanation?
Yes, yes. So I think the point you made is very important. So what you are going to test, what you want to see, and without thinking about that, my question can be taken as a very, vague or unclear question, but I understand what you mean. So yeah, that's great.
And so you didn't agree that the report and non-report paradigm is not applied to the color discrimination, right? So you think that we need to another approach of this phenomenon, right?
Or what I wanted to say is that in this paper, the author says that some NCC approaches or any contrastive approaches assume the sequence of information processing. And this is not only for, I think, the consciousness research, but also any other psychology studies. And without that sequential concept, it's really difficult to investigate what do you want to, see. And just the color discrimination is just an example for that. So if you want to see color or the mechanism, if you want to see or observe or test the mechanism of color discrimination, you need to assume that. And otherwise, I feel it's very difficult to test or what kind of experiment you can do. So it's a very tough question. So that sequential, concept is somehow necessary. But the point of, I think, this paper is that if you are talking about consciousness, as Aniko mentioned, you need to, focus on the phenomenology, or you need to at least mention about the phenomenology, and it cannot be tested by that kind of the contrastive approaches with the assumption of sequential concept. So that's the point. Does it clear your?
Yeah,
okay?
I see.
So I was wondering if, this was quite a long paper and complicated one, so I definitely had to read quickly, and I don't recall, but I wanted to check if I'm remembering correctly. So I don't think the authors mention attribute amnesia, right? Attribute amnesia.
Attribute amnesia. Attentional amnesia or something, or intentional.
Yeah. They mention inattentional blindness and inattentional amnesia.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so when I was reading that section, this section is about the consciousness, unconsciousness, and reportability, these kind of relationships. I was just thinking that actually attribute amnesia is a very good example for their claim, because they kind of say that we assume that if something comes into your consciousness, then it remains available for report constantly, or at least for a longer time. And but they ask a question whether this is the right assumptions, and if we can actually see examples of people perceiving something consciously but then just forgetting, or somehow not being able to report it. And I think, so attribute amnesia is actually this phenomenon, because of course you are clearly perceiving, clearly experiencing something, but you're unable to report it. I was just thought that that's actually quite interesting.
Yeah, so I don't think the attributional amnesia was mentioned in this paper.
Maybe if I can have another question. So I was wondering if, do you guys agree with that one of the main kind of takeaway or an important takeaway is this, like, focusing on the phenomenology or addressing that as well. And I think, again, this seems pretty much in line with the qualia structure project and about, like, focusing neural correlates of, like, phenomenology in a way, and how it is kind of again, I think a couple of weeks ago, Jota mentioned that seemingly many people are coming up with similar ideas. And this seems like another instance of that, which is, again, I think quite nice. Was it also like, was I just projecting this idea into the paper, or were you also understanding this section as kind of being in line with the qualia structure approach?
So first, I need to say that I didn't spend much time on the phenomenological or the part for the phenomenology. So I just couldn't make any comments on that. But as you know, my current project is related to this paper. And specifically, while I started the project, I had strong assumption in my mind about the sequential concept. And then this paper about the same thing, right? So the takeaway from this paper for me is that, probably any, not only for NCC, but also any like approaches have some implicit assumptions which have never been tested. So whenever you do, I mean, no matter what kind of experiment you do, you need to think about your assumption, implicit assumption, and make it clear. Or if you read a paper about anything, and these implicit assumption might not be, written in the paper. So by seeking for that implicit assumption can be possibly future beneficial, like a research project. So in that sense, that's my take home from this paper. So we need to think about the implicit assumption and then ask whether we can test it or not. And if we can test it, then just do it. And if we can say that the assumption is true, then that's good. But at the same time, if we found that the assumption is not true, that's also good. So that's a kind of way to find a new possible research project. That's just my, take home. Ryoichi, what do you think about the Korea structure relation, or the relation between the Korea structure and this paper?
I think, yeah, for the assumption, like the implicit assumption 2 and 3, the temporal and spatial attention assumption in the neural activity, and the structure of the information in our project are related, I think, but I don't think the relation between them deeply. But yeah, and also in this, the authors did propose that like the yeah. So yeah, complex spatial and temporal changes will be measured by IAT's method, the global information transformation, and also I think the other way of examining that yes, our Korea project is project the point that the structure of the brain activity is more related to this measure in this study. Yeah.
So Aniko, the phenomenology part is the last, just before the conclusion, right? I think the additional approaches where they mentioned the many theories, including IITs. Yeah, I don't know, because I feel the point of Korea structure approaches is on the structure. So yeah, of course the phenomenology is important, but whether we can see that structure in Korea or any phenomenology can be observed in the brain or whatever. So that's the point. So I don't know, probably related, but again, I didn't spend much time on this part, so I don't know. I just don't know. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess so. They say something like kind of bringing or integrating phenomenology should actually like they also mentioned the structure and the form of the correlated phenomenology with the brain activity. So maybe that was the section that kind of made me think about the qualia structure. But anyhow, I don't want to derail the conversation.
Yeah, but I didn't spend much time on that part, so I just overlooked that. But if the paper, there was such kind of sentences in this paper, then I'd say that that's somehow, or many researchers, or not many, but some researchers started to think like similar thing, or started to have similar ideas, and then started to propose their ideas independently. But somehow what we read are consistent. That and I think the one thing I feel interesting is that there are some theories of consciousness, like global neural space, higher order theory, IAT, and temporal spatial integration theory, not integration, but that kind of many different types of consciousness theory. And sometimes if you classify or categorize the theories, people started to say is that the posterior versus frontal parietal, things like that. That's one way of categorizing the theories of consciousness. But here I think interesting, or the interesting way of categorizing theory is that the sequential concept versus non-sequential concept, I think, because definitely global New York space is, or assume the sequential concept or perception. In this paper, higher order theory somehow classified as the sequential concept of perception, but IIT and other theories are classified as something that do not assume the sequential concept. So I have never thought that way. So that makes me feel, oh, probably this is interesting way to, see different theories of consciousness.
Yeah, I think it's again it comes back to to this question whether the theory is originally set out to explain a mechanism or they were focusing on something else. I think especially with global neural workspace theory, it was definitely kind of one of the main question is how do you transfer, how do you step over this boundary between unconscious and conscious? And that kind of, again, as this paper describes, that assumption supports this serial approach of processing, because of you need to kind of assume that first you have information coming into the unconscious section, and then it goes to the conscious section, or yeah. And perhaps I guess IIT was not meant to, or it wasn't meant to explain such processes.
I agree with you. So the point is that, again, what the theory tried to, answer. So in that sense, it's not good to, see all theories of consciousness as equally, because some theories explain this and the other explains this, things like that, right? Yeah, I agree with you. And we need to be careful about that, especially when we compare, two different theories. Because recently I read a paper about the adversarial approaches, which is about the comparison of theories. And there they mention, or the authors mentions that higher, not higher, front parietal versus posterior hot tone is one way to test the prediction from two different theories. But if the theories try to explain different thing, that kind of comparison just strange. So yeah, I need to be careful about that.
But I think it's also difficult because you need to make, I think you want to make progress on these theories, and at some point you need to start testing them and compare them. And I was just thinking, as you were talking previously about whether we can test assumptions and so I think I completely agree with this idea that we need to be aware of our assumptions and be very kind of conscious of them and examine them from time to time. But I think it's also some of these assumptions are pretty hard to to actually falsify or to completely prove or disprove, because these are very general kind of understanding of how things work. And I think in many cases a single experiment will never be able to disprove such assumptions, but it's more like a series of work and a series of competing ideas kind of collecting evidence against these assumptions. or at least just limiting their validity into certain situations. So yeah, so I think I just wanted to point this out, that I think from a kind of practical perspective, I think it's very useful to talk about these assumptions and evaluate them, but I also don't think that it's possible to really prove them or disprove them. Or at least I couldn't really think of like experiments or easy examples. How would you disprove something like serial processing of information?
I completely agree with you. So in my project, I'm going to test some assumption, and if we can find, or if, we can find something, but it does not mean that, the idea or the assumption we tested is, false or not true. We need a lot of, evidences to support our ideas. And also sometimes, even awareing the assumption is very important, but at the same time, if we, be careful too much about it, as you mentioned, Aniko, it's impossible to, make a progress. So we are somehow, need to be lenient for progress. I don't know. And I think we've already discussed this paper like 45 minutes. So if you have any, comments or question, you can ask now. No? Okay, then see you next week. Goodbye.